Good evening. I would like to tell you tonight about some colorful characters and inspiring inhabitants of Paducah. Probably a lot of them, or maybe most of them, you've never heard of before. But nonetheless, they are either very colorful or inspiring. And I'm going to start with the colorful characters. And my first one is a woman named Rosalie, better known as Ma Little. With a smile and a "thank you, honey," the little old silver-haired lady would sell peanuts and goods on the streets of downtown Paducah in the late 1920s and 1930s. She became a friend to all and a monument to friendship and how a community helps each other. Her name was Rosalie Little, but to all of her customers and most of Paducah, she was simply known as Ma Little. Her life was anything but ordinary. Born in 1868, at a young age, she ran off to join the circus. She became a bareback rider in the Barnum and Bailey Circus, as well as the Terrell Brothers show, which was based in Paducah. The Terrells had a circus first and then formed Buckskin Bill's Wild West show. It was while she was performing in the circus that she met her husband, Marion, or better known as Hop. Hop Little was a clown for 19 years in the Barnum and Bailey Circus. When they both retired from the circus, they settled down in Paducah. Hop was an auctioneer. In 1928, at age 59, Ma was faced with a financial crisis and started selling peanuts on the downtown streets. People enjoyed buying from this little old lady described as stooped in years. After every sale, she would smile and say, "Thank you, honey." Things got even more hard for her when Hop died. And Luther Carson stepped in and purchased a cart for her. She would take the cart to the press room of the Paducah Sun, where she would sell her wares to the people there. The reporters and even the carrier boys who promised to pay her when they got paid. And they did. She expanded her wares to cold drinks, candy in the summer, and even ice cream. By 1936, she had so many customer friends that they decided to do something to help this little old lady, who was usually dressed in her heavy tan dress with a billed cap. The downtown business people decided that she needed a store to keep her out of the ever-changing weather. T.O. Thomas headed this group. Edgar Ferguson donated property on 10th and Broadway, next to where the Ferguson building still stands. Workers from labor unions donated their times and skills, with businessmen donating the materials. Her store, a truly community effort, opened on May 30th, 1936. Ma proclaimed it the happiest day of her life. Overwhelmed, she said, "It is true that a friend in need is a friend indeed," and mounted a sign in the front stating, "My friends built this place for me, and I am happy." Her story caught the attention of a vaudeville star from Paducah, Jack Major, who wrote it into a drama and sold it to a radio program. The producers loved it and invited Mrs. Little to come to New York, all expenses paid. She and T.O. Thomas went to New York and recreated the roles they filled in life. In November of 1936, it seemed like all Paducans were glued to their radio, weeping with joy when they heard her voice on coast-to-coast radio. Unfortunately, the store was short-lived, as 2 years later, Rosalie died at age 69. In her will, she regarded the kindness of her friends not as gifts, but as loans. She directed that her store become the property once more of Mr. Ferguson, and funeral expenses paid with her insurance money, and all the remaining to reimburse all those who contributed to her store. Ma's one regret in life was that after her son returned from World War I, he never contacted her. Heartbroken over her wayward son, she willed him $1. Shortly after she died, the Paducah Sun received a letter from him asking about how his mother died. Mr. Thomas, who was in charge of the will, mailed him his $1. Her story is a testimony to Paducans. She got by with very little help from her friends. She got by with a little help from her friends and the community as a whole, which is how it should always be. This was our community in the 1930s, and I believe is still today. We are Paducah proud and Paducah strong. My next one is a man named John N., better known as Daddy Hessian. Now, John Hessian was born in Paducah in 1861 and was a well-respected police officer for over 40 years. But to all who knew him, especially the children, he was known as Daddy Hessian. For over 30 years, he served not only as a police officer, but also a protector and a crossing guard to the students at Washington School, which had been the Paducah High School at Broadway and 13th. He was a living example of what everything a policeman ought to be, upholding the law, but a friend to the citizens. He expected obedience to the law by kindness and love, not force and harshness. He was a quiet, kindly man, patient and tolerant to the faults of others. One time, while on patrol near the school, he saw a young man fleeing from a store. The youth had stolen a loaf of bread and was trying to get to his grandfather in Tennessee. He was on the verge of starvation. When learning this, the store owner gave him a sandwich. Now, instead of arresting him, Daddy wished him luck and slipped 2 quarters in his hand. Daddy later said, "I couldn't resist or arrest a boy like that. Why, he was starving." He was always watching out for speeders at that busy intersection of Broadway and 13th and would promptly tag people for speeding, then tell them, "Say there, what do you think this is, a racetrack?" There was no telling how many accidents were prevented and saved by Daddy. He would personally escort people, small children, across the street. He knew, and they knew, he would protect them, and depended on him to keep an eye out for him. He once said, "I stand up for my children, and I love them. I have stuck by the children, rain or shine, thick or thin." He said he always felt that the modern children have changed for the better, and were full of life and eager and to achieve something. The youth loved him. They were concerned about his health and, along with the school officials, started a movement to give Daddy summers off. Daddy had other achievements, such as capturing a murder suspect in 1901. He also worked with Roy Manchester at the Boy Scout summer camps. He was a surrogate father, a chaplain, and a parent to all of those scouts. In 1934, Daddy slipped and fell and fractured his hip, which caused him to have to retire from the force. The children did not forget him, though, for while he was recuperating, he had constant visitors, and the Scout Drum and Bugle Corps even serenaded him at his home on Jefferson. In numerous articles written about him in the paper, he was always referred to as Daddy Hessian. The city knew who he was and loved him. When he died in 1936, he had many tributes to him, especially from the Scouts and the children at Washington School. There are many unsung heroes in the police force today as well. We should always honor these brave men and women who put their lives on the line to protect us. Daddy was a symbol of these officers, and let's always remember them and thank them when we see them. My next colorful character, you may have heard of him, Judge William S. Bishop. In the McCracken County Courthouse, there hangs a portrait of a man who even has his own historical marker outside the courthouse. He was the model of Irvin Cobb's character of the Judge Priest. His real name was William Bishop. Born in Trigg County, he studied law at Transylvania University, and under Oscar Turner, who has his own monument on Jefferson Street, he was admitted to the bar in 1861 at the start of the Civil War. That same year, he enlisted in the Confederate Army, being captured at Vicksburg. Later, he taught school, and then he started a law practice in the early 1880s. He became the judge of the 1st Judicial District. A young Irvin Cobb would visit him and be spellbound as the judge would tell of his war experiences. Cobb would later recall these times with the judge and modeled his character, Judge Priest, after Bishop. The judge had a big heart and once provided a funeral for an unfortunate girl and rerouted a circus parade so it would pass right by the home of a disabled boy. But he was also known for being slow to action, as they put it, as his court docket was usually a year behind. He was also known for his absent-mindedness. Once, while walking on Broadway, reading a paper, he collided with a cow. Without looking up, he tipped his hat and uttered, "Madam, I most humbly beg your pardon." Another time, on Jefferson, he had another such collision which knocked off his glasses. Now, he was blind without his glasses, and enraged, he yelled, "You miserable cow! Why the city permits you to walk these streets, I don't know." Finding his glasses, he realized his mistake and profusely apologized to the startled woman. Then there was a time, coming back from a trial in Smithland, he told his wife that he was embarrassed because he ran out of shirts. She told him she had packed 3 for him. She opened the buttons on his shirt and found him wearing all 3 shirts. Years later, with the popularity of the Judge Priest character, Will Rogers would play the role in a movie modeled after him. When he died in 1902 in Hinkville, and yes, there really was such a place, the Paducah Bar Association resolved to honor the judge and stated, quote, "In him the elements were so well blended that nature might stand up and say, 'This was a man,'" unquote. My next character is a man named George T.A. Gilbert, or better known as most of people in Paducah as Don Gilberto, or Don Gilberto, or Doc, excuse me. Born outside of Havana, Cuba in 1836, Don Gilberto had been described as one of Paducah's most colorful characters. He was a most respected citizen of Paducah, and although it took a while to reach Paducah, once he was here, he loved his adopted home in Kentucky. There were many times that he wanted to visit friends who lived away from Paducah, but never went, for, as he put it, "My one wish is to pass my last day in Paducah." So he didn't travel far in fear that he might die while away. Born in Havana, of parents of Irish and Danish descent, he had a rough early life. His father, who was a sugarcane plantation owner, was wealthy and sympathized with the downtrodden Cubans. He was robbed of his land by the Spanish tyranny. While Don Gilberto was still very young boy, he lost both of his parents and, along with his brothers and sisters, lived with an uncle until the uncle died. All the children were then, as they put it, thrown into the world, never to be reunited again in their lifetimes. He found homes in Central America and even Australia. Back once in Cuba as an adult, he served 7 years as a storekeeper on a government and royal vessels. He deserted during the Cuban Revolution. And he himself was a Cuban revolutionist himself during the 1871. Soon after, he took passage on a schooner which stopped in Florida. He read about America and wanted to live there. He migrated from Florida to Louisiana, to Texas, and finally up the Mississippi. He lived at Cape Girardeau for a while, then made his way to Golconda, Illinois, where he married. From there, the couple went to Cairo, Illinois, and finally arrived in Paducah in 1882. It was said that he had many careers and would tackle anything short of a profession. However, he did go to Chicago and graduated as an oculist, which is an older term for an optometrist, which earned him the title doctor. He was known to everyone in Paducah as either Don Gilberto or, after becoming the oculist, Doc Gilberto. In Spanish, the title Don is a honorific title of respect. I'm not sure how Gilbert became Gilberto, but just as many immigrants Americanized their surnames, perhaps he did the reverse to create a mystique of his Cuban background and experiences. He eventually led a very successful career in Paducah and became a local philanthropist. And although he was very charitable, he was modest and disliked notoriety. He and his wife never had children, but he was especially generous to widows and children. On many occasions, he would anonymously purchase a large load of watermelons to be sent to the McCracken County Sanitarium for every inmate to receive a whole melon. He also sent large amounts of candy there to last each one for a day. He was quite the collector, amassing as a numismatist very rare coins and was considered an expert in the field. He collected, besides coins, walking sticks. It is said that he had one for every day of the year, and then some. Many were gold-handled or bejeweled. He had the first talking machine or phonograph in Paducah, and people would drive their buggies for miles around to hear this remarkable invention. Don would crank it up, put it on by an open window for all to play for all to hear. His varied career also included being a bartender, a caterer, and running a hotel called, what else? The Hotel Gilberto. He and his wife lived at 606 South 4th Street, and when he died, he was buried in the same plot that he had bought for several aged poor widows in Oak Grove. He was definitely a character remembered by all Paducans who lived during his lifetime. And now on to Captain Jack, as I call him, John Lawson. John Lawson was a very colorful man who boasted many claims. He was better known in Paducah and elsewhere as Captain Jack Lawson, and was born in Lancaster, England in 1805. At a very young age, Jack learned the trade of a machinist. He was employed by Robert Stephenson, the inventor and designer of several types of steam engines. Stephenson was credited to designing the very first locomotive he called the Rocket. Lawson was on the team which built this engine in 1825, and the very first ever successfully operated steam locomotive in the world. Lawson claimed he was the engineer of it, which therefore made him the very first steam-powered locomotive engineer in the world. In the late 1820s, Lawson was sent to America by Stephenson to deliver, set up, and run a locomotive for him with him on a boat. Lawson also claimed to be the very first engineer to run a locomotive in America. He was in his early 20s. He also stated that after voting for General Jackson, he, quote, said, "I carried Jackson and Martin Van Buren from the Relay House in Washington on my engine," end quote. Andrew Jackson was the first president to ever ride on a locomotive. Lawson stayed in Baltimore 3 years, moving to Philadelphia and then Alabama to set up railroads there. In Alabama, he met Emily Speed, who became his wife. She became interested in commerce on the western rivers, or he did, and moved to Paducah around 1840, claiming to drive out the Indians in Paducah. He claimed a lot of things. He worked the steamboats there, first in the boiler room, then moving up to captain, where he got his title. According to an interview in St. Louis in 1897, he worked the steamboats and railroads for over 60 years. He said, quote, "I am Jack Lawson of Kentucky, but blankety blanket, how do you fellas know that I was here?" End quote. He would rip out a good cuss word at intervals, and when ladies were present, would apologize for this, and he would say, quote, "Excuse me, madam, it would slip out sometimes. I try to keep it back," end quote. When asked how fast early trains traveled, he said, quote, "Why, they went as fast as they do now. We just didn't care a blankety blank for anything. Oh, excuse me, madam, it will slip out occasionally," end quote. He helped build the very first railroad connecting Paducah to the outside world. He once said, quote, "I am proud of one thing in my life. By river or by rail, in over 60 years, I never had an accident while running my engine," end quote. He made notable runs, like the one from Paducah to Mayfield, 26 miles in 17 minutes, which was a record in those days. He was in the 3rd Kentucky Regiment of Confederates during the Civil War. In an interview when he was 92, he said, quote, "If there was another war, I'd go again. I can shoot yet if I had to," end quote. When Jack was in his 80s, President Grover Cleveland appointed him engineer of the Customs House in Paducah, the only office he actually ever had. Of Cleveland, he said, quote, "He gave me a hearty welcome, sat right down there, and we talked together in the White House. Why, we were chums," end quote. He continued in that position until 1897 at age 92, when he gave it up. When William Jennings Bryan came to Paducah in 1896, Lawson claimed, quote, "He had me up on the platform with him. He got me a chair, made me sit by his side. I voted for him, and I'd do it again if I had the chance," end quote. He got the chance because Bryan ran for president 3 times as the Democratic candidate. Asked in his interview in 1897 what he attributed to his advanced age and health, and if he had been temperate, his eyes twinkled, and he replied, quote, "Yes, when I was sober," end quote. He never wore glasses and took his toddy every day and smoked regularly. While in his later years in Paducah, he and his wife lived on the northwest corner of 7th and Broadway. He died in 1901 in St. Louis at age 96 while he was on one of his power walks. His body was sent back to be buried with his wife, who died in 1891. They lie in Mount Kenton Cemetery in Paducah. Captain Jack was certainly a colorful character, and if all the facts that he claimed and that were printed in the papers are true, he led a very productive, interesting, and amazing life, contributing much to history. Now, you've heard about the colorful characters. Now let's learn about some interesting and inspiring inhabitants of Paducah. And the first one, Ferd Hummel. No, it's not Fred, it's Ferd. An interesting name. Immigrant, soldier, gunsmith, inventor. That's just some of the words used to describe Ferd or Ferdinand Hummel. He was born in Germany in 1827, and as a young man served in Germany's army. It was there, in the country of his birth, that he learned the gunsmith trade. He immigrated to America in 1854, first to Pennsylvania, and then he moved to Paducah in 1861 at the beginning of the Civil War. Paducah was then the hub of immigrants who specialized in mechanics. There was even a section of the local area named Mechanicsburg. He set up a one-storied gunsmith shop at 109 North 4th Street. During the Union occupation of Paducah by General Grant, the Federals made use of his ability as a gunsmith. The soldiers would have their guns repaired at his shop. But then, in 1864, Confederates raided Paducah under the command of General Nathan B. Forrest. The Confederates also raided Mr. Hummel's shop, looking for weapons. Hummel had heard of rumors of this pending raid, so he moved most of his guns to his home on Jefferson, on the north side between 1st and 2nd Street, the area about where the public restrooms are now located in the parking lot. And there he hid all the guns behind false walls in his home. Mr. Hummel started the first public library in Paducah. Here we are in our beautiful McCracken County Library. He started the first one. He bought 200 books dealing with mechanical subjects as well as historical and biographical titles. This was donated to the Mechanical Institute to be shared among members. This library occupied 2 locations. Before the Mechanics Institute, he donated all the books to the local YMCA. Now, when that club ceased to exist, the Carnegie Library took over the collection. And the rest is library history. But Ferd Hummel was more than just a gunsmith. He was an inventor. He invented a breech-loading firearm in 1881 and received a patent for it. In 1886, he received a patent for a bolt movement for rifles, which revolutionized the action of the rifle and became universal on firearms, especially those of the U.S. military, for well into the 1930s. In an old newspaper story from 1931, a man named Louis Massey from Caskel had in his possession an old cup and ball rifle. On the top of the barrel was a trademark, F. Hummel, Paducah, Kentucky. It was one of Mr. Hummel's first improvements of firearms before he patented the bolt action. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and sometimes it is items that are used every day which can use improving. Back in the 1800s, before the days of electrical power and electrical lights, people used coal oil to light their lamps. The coal oil had a spout with a screw top and a thimble which people were constantly misplacing, and it caused many spills. This, of course, would emit harsh odors, especially in the grocery stores where it was sold. People usually used a piece of potato as a stopper. In 1881, Hummel invented a rotating valve under the lid of the can, which eliminated the screw top and thimble. This gained a large market for more than half a century, but waned after the advancement of electricity. Mr. Hummel had several sons who later went into the insurance business in Paducah, but one son, Ferd Jr., is credited as a co-inventor of the oil can valve with his father. Ferd Hummel died in 1907 at his home at 923 South 4th at 79 years old, and is buried in Oak Grove Cemetery in Paducah. Now for the ladies out there. There were many great advances that the ladies of Paducah did in Paducah during the early times, 100 years ago. And this one is Dr. Dalia Caldwell. In the day when a woman's place was in the home, Dalia Caldwell was a Paducah resident, and she broke all kinds of ground for women. She was born in 1860 in Hopkinsville, the daughter of Isaac and Eveline Caldwell. Isaac was a cashier in the Bank of Kentucky during the Civil War, and he buried $200,000 from the bank in a well to keep it from the Confederates. During that time, Confederates drank from that well but didn't discover it. After the war, he dug it up and returned it to the bank. But now, let's get back to Dalia. After the Civil War, the family moved to Carbondale, Illinois, where Dalia went to school. She went to college, which was unusual for a woman in those days, and graduated at age 18 from the State Normal College in 1878. She taught public school for a number of years in Illinois and other states before deciding to study medicine. She studied medicine at Northwestern University of Chicago and graduated in 1896 at age 36. After an internship in Boston, Dr. Caldwell moved to Paducah, and in 1898 set up a practice on 522 Broadway, later moving her office and residence to 735 Broadway, about the location of the pool by Broadway Methodist now. She became very interested in welfare work and became a board member of the Home of the Friendless, an orphanage in Paducah, where she remained an active member for many years. But her uniqueness did not stop there. She worked locally for the study of the prevention of tuberculosis. She was elected to the Paducah Board of Education, breaking ground there as the first woman elected to that board. But she went on to become the first woman to be the president of the Paducah Board of Education. She was regarded as a staunch supporter of schools, having been a teacher herself for a number of years, and worked through many difficulties with the board and the school system. In 1908, on a trip to Chicago for a medical meeting, she made arrangements for Alfonso Taft to create the statue of Chief Paduk, now located on Jefferson Street. She went on to claim many more accolades, and in 1911, she became the very first female to be elected to an office of high rank in the Kentucky State Medical Society, which was affiliated with the AMA. Thus, she became the first female in the history of the AMA to attain a high rank as well, as she was the vice president of the Kentucky Medical Society. In 1917, at the outbreak of World War I, she volunteered to join the Army Medical Reserves as a doctor, but was turned down because she was a woman. The Surgeon General stated that women could not meet the demand of the battlefield and were not qualified to command men. Also, since women could not vote, yes, they couldn't vote in 1917, therefore the use of the word citizen in the Army Reserves didn't apply to women. She was a true patriot in every sense of the word. Since most of her immediate family still lived in Carbondale, she left Paducah in 1918 for Carbondale, being lauded by the Paducah Board of Education for her service as a board member and then as president of the Board of Education. She was also praised by the Kentucky County Equal Rights Association. As a tribute to her, they wrote this, quote, "You began in Paducah as a pioneer in the wider fields of women's occupations, but then you blazed a path so clearly that all women who follow will find the burdens lighter because of the crosses that you have borne so bravely and nobly," end quote. Through the years, she came back to Paducah from time to take up residence. She went on to become the medical director of the Southern Illinois Normal School in Carbondale. She died in 1945 and is buried in Carbondale. Dalia Caldwell was a pioneer for women in a man's world and remained undaunted throughout her life, making strides for women in many fields. And now we go on to another very interesting man, Cesar Caskel. Exodus 18:62. Before you start looking that verse up in your Bible, it's actually an event in history, not a Bible verse. Exodus 18:62. That's the story when the Jews were being expelled from Paducah and the bravery of a man who went against the system. During the Civil War and occupation, and as he put it, the protection of Paducah by the Union Army, and after General Grant's landing, Paducah went through some hard times. Now, Grant left General E.A. Payne in command. Payne reported to Grant that the Jews of Paducah were secessionists and the merchants were suspected of dealing with the enemy and were actively engaged in buying and smuggling supplies to the enemy. He said the Jews were profiteering, and he further blamed the Jews for keeping alive bands of roving guerrillas which were harassing the Union troops. Well, Grant, in the heat of a campaign of the war, consequently issued the infamous Order Number 11 on December 11, 1862, which stated, "The Jews, as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from this department within 24 hours of the receipt of this order." It further warned that they will see that all this class of people are furnished with passes and required to leave, and any returning after such notification will be arrested and held in confinement until the opportunity occurs of sending them out as prisoners, unless furnished by permits from this headquarters. End quote. 30 Jewish families were forced to leave their homes and given less than a day to prepare for their deportation. They were given no hearing, and there was no attempt to determine if any had actually been giving aid and comfort to the enemy. In fact, with Payne's allegations, unfortunately, this became the very first great anti-Semitic movement in Paducah, in America, I should say. With news of this atrocity, when it became public, it aroused Jews and Gentiles, Confederates and Federals. Transports were docked at the foot of Broadway to take the Jewish families to Cincinnati. Among those to be deported was a 30-year-old merchant, Cesar Caskel, along with his brother, J.W., and a jeweler named D. Wolfe. As they traveled up the river, these three brave men determined to fight this order if it took going to Washington, D.C. When they arrived in Cincinnati, they sent a telegram to President Lincoln, quote, "This inhumane order, the carrying out of which would be the greatest violation of the Constitution and our rights as citizens, and would place us, besides a large number of Jewish families in this town, as outlaws before the world," end quote. They received no reply. Lincoln received another such letter, which read, quote, An order expelling and ostracizing all Jews as a class has been issued by Major General U.S. Grant and has been enforced at Holly Springs, Trenton, Corinth, Paducah, Jackson, and other locations. In the name of that class of loyal citizens of these United States, in which in part we represent, in the name of the hundreds who have been driven from their homes, deprived of their liberty, and injured in their prosperity without having violated any law or regulation. In the name of thousands of our brethren and our children who have died and are now willingly sacrificing their lives and fortunes for the Union and the suppression of this rebellion, in the name of religious liberty, of justice and humanity, we enter our solemn protest against this order and ask of you, the defender and protector of the Constitution, to annul this order and protect the liberties even of your humblest constituents." End quote. Caskel, undaunted by lack of an answer, contacted Congressman John Gurley of Ohio, who accompanied them to Washington. They met with President Lincoln on the Sunday afternoon immediately following his signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. The conversation went in part as follows. Lincoln: "So the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan." Caskel: "Yes, that is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom, asking protection." Lincoln smiled, pondered the question at hand, then reached for a pen and paper. He then said, "And this protection they shall have at once." He wrote out an order to division headquarters in St. Louis and ordered it sent by telegraph. He also wrote on the back to General Halleck, Grant's commander, "I have today," as you can see here, January 5th, 1863, "written General Grant about this." After Lincoln sent the telegraph, General Halleck immediately sent a message to Grant, quote, "A paper purporting to be General Orders number 11, issued by you on December 17th, has been presented here. By its terms, it expels all Jews from your department. If such an order has been issued, it will be immediately revoked." End quote. After penning the message to Halleck, Lincoln turned to Mr. Caskel and said, "You may return home when you wish. Before you reach there, Grant's order will have been removed." End quote. Grant complied to the order 3 days later. When Caskel returned to Cincinnati, he rented a boat, loaded the Jewish Paducans, and headed home. When they landed at the foot of Broadway, they were met by a group of soldiers, along with the provost marshal, who tried to prevent them from coming ashore. The provost marshal boarded the boat and demanded to know by whose order are they returning. And Caskel replied, "By orders of the President of the United States." Grant later did recognize he made a serious mistake with Order number 11 and apologized. As president, he went out of his way to appoint Jews to high-level positions and even spoke out against anti-Semitic discrimination in Europe. And what happened to Cesar Caskel? He left Paducah around 1864 for New York City, where he and his brother established a very successful clothing store for many years. The building, as you can see, still stands in Manhattan to this day. For those interested in the rest of the story, as well, a very well-written book on the subject was written by Jonathan Serna, When General Grant Expelled the Jews. In 2012, Mr. Sarna spoke at the McCracken County Public Library's Evening Upstairs series. Cesar Caskel was a man who faced an injustice, but instead of accepting it, he went to great lengths, even going to the president, to make sure it was corrected. And I think you can probably find that Evening Upstairs on the website of the library. My final subject is George Washington Dupey. He was also known as Pappy Dupey, and he was truly an amazing man with an amazing story, who accomplished so much in his 70 years against all odds. on his 16-foot monument in Oak Grove Cemetery is written, quote, "He was a kind and affectionate and a friend to all. His memory will be blessed." There's also a quote from Romans 1:16. "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth." End quote. A marker in front of Washington Baptist Church in Paducah credits him as the pastor at the construction of a brick church there in 1893. But he did so much more than can be crowded into an historical marker. Dupey was born a slave in 1827 in Gallatin County, Kentucky. His mother died 2 weeks after giving birth and dedicated him to God. She asked people to raise him properly, for the boy was for God's own purpose, and he would be very useful. He heard about the gospel at a young age and was converted in 1841 at age 14 and baptized in South Elkhorn Creek. Although a slave, he was determined to preach the gospel for his life calling. At age 17 in 1844, he learned the alphabet, and the very first thing he read was John 3:16, and which, as a slave, learning to read was forbidden. He was the slave of a Baptist preacher, Lewis Craig, but was allowed to preach in a black church in Lexington. He married in 1848 Miss Matilda Green, and he married at the old governor's mansion in Frankfort. He was ordained as a minister in 1851 by Georgetown College's president, James Reynolds, and he became the minister of the Pleasant Green Baptist Church in Lexington, as well as another church, preaching at both. This was while he was still a slave. Craig, his owner, died in 1847, but the estate wasn't settled until 1856. It was in that year that Dupey was placed on the auction block at Cheapside, which was at the county courthouse. His congregation wanted to do something to make him a free man. The church went to a minister by the name of William Pratt, who was a sponsor of the Pleasant Green Baptists. He was also a known abolitionist and emancipationist, who in the past had been known to buy slaves in order to free them. The members asked him to purchase Dupey. The deacons of Pratt's church agreed and raised $830 for the sale. Dupey was then made a free man. But, even not expected to, his congregation wanted to reimburse Pratt and his church and passed the collection plate weekly for months, sending the collection wrapped in a handkerchief to Pratt. Finally, payment was completed. This church today, with the name of Pleasant Green Missionary Baptist Church, has a program titled the George W. Dupey Bible Institute. While Dupey was preaching and organizing churches in the Lexington area and other areas, in Paducah, an African American church was being organized. In those days, before the Civil War, at least one reputable white person had to be in attendance in order to sponsor such a church. So, in 1854, with the help of a young white minister, George Brent, from the First Baptist Church, the black church was started. Brent had taken a strong stand for the freedom of slaves and preached at both churches for 3 years until slave owners in Paducah forced him to abandon the group. A log cabin was readied by 1855. He rose from an illiterate slave to a man respected by all colors. He started preaching at the new Washington Street Baptist Church part-time in 1858, preaching also in Lexington, and then came in 1858 full-time in Paducah. On his first Sunday in Paducah, he baptized 81 people in 14 minutes. In all, he preached 45 years in 12 churches, received over 12,000 church memberships, baptized over 10,000 people, 2,000 in Paducah alone, married over 13,000 couples, and preached at more than 12,000 funerals. He received a doctorate of divinity from the State University of Louisville and an honorary law degree, which gave him the full title of George Washington Dupey, D.D., LL.D. He was the first black minister in Western Kentucky. He edited and organized in Paducah the Baptist Herald, the first black newspaper in Kentucky. He organized 21 churches in western Kentucky. Seeing the need for a black church in the north side of Paducah, he organized the Harrison Street Missionary Baptist Church as well as a Pleasant Grove Baptist. He was one of the founders of the General Association of Colored Baptists, the founder of the First District Baptist Association, of which he was the moderator for over 28 years, and organized the very first black Masonic Lodge in western Kentucky. He had the nickname Pappy, which carried with him a big hickory stick of about 2 inches thick and 3 feet long, which he took to the pulpit to remind everybody to behave. He felt it was important for the church to move out of the log cabin and started to have a brick church built. In a news article from 1894, it mentioned that he donated to his church his yearly salary of $800. It was stated that Dupey had a library full of books which took up 3 rooms. He seldom read something he did not remember, and he was the foremost Greek and Latin scholar in Paducah, from a former slave to this. He was called the greatest organizer of churches from Fayette County to the western part of Kentucky. George Washington Dupey was visiting in Kansas City, Missouri in September of 1897. At the close of his sermon titled, "Ye Must Be Born Again," he passed away at the age of 70. He had pastored Washington Street Baptist for 39 years. In 1895, a biographer said, quote, "When the Lord of the harvest calls for the reapers, Dr. Dupey will carry with him many sheaves," end quote. There were over 1,200 people in attendance at his funeral at Oak Grove. The choir sang, appropriately, "How Firm a Foundation," as well as "Asleep in Jesus." His large monument in Oak Grove pays tribute to this amazing man. He was a story of determination, dedication, service to God, giving of himself, and humble service to his community of churches. Now, all of these citizens of Paducah, whether they be colorful or inspiring, all helped to shape Paducah to what it is today. I hope you enjoyed this and go do more research maybe on these men. Thank you very much.